Clay Young and Kevin Meeks are here with you, and joining us live in studio right now is U.S. Congressman Dr. Bill Cassidy, representing the 6th Congressional District of Louisiana. Here with us, how are you?
I am good, gentlemen. How are y'all?
Now,
Great.
You've been out of Washington. You guys have been on recess for how long now?
Whenever we did that dadgum debt deal, so I want to say that was the first week of August.
So like the 3rd, because the deadline was the 2nd. So you guys left the next day? Yeah. So just update us on how things are. Oh, before we do any of that, can't have you in here and not ask you about this thing with these LSU football players. As you know, it's big story going on right now. Any thoughts?
Well, I agree with what J.R. Ball said. It's happened for a long time, but now there's increased scrutiny. And that's a good thing, because a young man who's given that privilege, as any young person is who's given privilege, needs to understand the responsibility of privilege.
Yeah.
Now, we don't jump to judgment, but at the same time, you see where I'm going with that.
Yeah. All right, 9 after the hour, we'll come back and continue with Congressman Cassidy here on W. So, what's the deal? Washington right now is not a popular place. I'm sure you're very much happier to be back in Baton Rouge and out of the district. Upon your return, there is a lot still to be done. This super committee is going to be scouring spending to find this $1.3 trillion. We've got other issues to address. People still have questions about immigration. We're watching what's happening in Libya and our involvement there. There's a possibility of some involvement maybe in Syria. Not to mention the deficit's going to grow by more than $7 trillion over the next 10 years. So y'all don't have much to do in Washington. So what are your thoughts on all of that?
Well, clearly, when you speak to people, they're concerned about jobs, they're concerned about the economy, they're concerned about the debt. Now, some folks are concerned that we're wrangling up in Washington. I can tell you, we're going to be wrangling for 4 or 5 years, because we're cutting a heck of a lot of money.
Yeah.
And whenever anybody has their pot of money cut, there's going to be complaints. And so we're going to be going around about regulations, rules, and money for the next couple Congresses, and frankly, that's a good thing.
Why is it okay to only cut $2.5 trillion in spending when the deficit is more than 14 and is going to grow by more than 7, and Americans right now are facing 9.1% unemployment? Why is there backslapping and celebration because of the grand deal when it doesn't look like much happened at all?
Oh, that's not true at all. A couple things. First, the debt deal that was signed cut $2.1 to $2.5 trillion. There's an additional $1.1 to $1.5 trillion that will also be cut, that everybody knows will be cut. There's $4 trillion right there. The second thing is that we actually put into place that we're going to vote on a balanced budget amendment. That for the first time in 15 years, we are going to actually have before Congress a balanced budget amendment.
That's going to be before the House.
And the Senate.
And the Senate's going to look at it too. So we're finally going to have this debate.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that is part of this deal as well.
Okay.
The third thing it does is that folks don't focus on this. It shows that Americans honor their debt.
Yeah.
Now, you may say that's no big deal.
No, it is a big deal.
It is a big. You know why it's a big deal, Clay? If we don't honor our debt, the interest rates we have to pay on our Treasury bills goes up.
No, we should honor our debt.
Now, let me say, and the reason is not just a moral reason.
We shouldn't grow our debt, but we should definitely honor our debt.
Absolutely. And the reason we should honor is not just moral, but financially.
Yeah.
Because if we don't, the interest rates we have to pay goes up. So what they said was that, and I believe this, it makes sense, that if we didn't have a deal, we would have spent $1 trillion more over 10 years in interest payments. Now, that means taxpayers pay it. So everybody who wants to have a better deal has to account for the fact that if you look like you're going to stiff the people who are lending to you, you got to pay them a higher interest, and everything extra you save goes for interest payments.
Now, we're talking with Dr. Bill Cassidy here, a congressman representing the 6th Congressional District. During the entire debate on the debt ceiling, took tons of calls and emails from people about this, and one overarching theme from people was, we as Americans, average Americans, have to practice some kind of fiscal responsibility or we lose. People lose their homes, they lose their cars, their children see their education funds poached because of things that come along, and they look at Washington, who hasn't had Washington has spent more than it's taken in since 1969. And they look at this and they go, well, why doesn't the federal government have to practice the same principles that we do here in the rest of the country? What do you say to that?
I agree with that entirely. And that's why the Balanced Budget Amendment, which is part of this deal, is so important. The Balanced Budget Amendment begins to require the federal government what families require themselves. But let me mention one more thing. Ideally, we'd be out of debt with the snap of the fingers. But anyone that ever listens to Dave Ramsey knows that you don't get out of debt with the snap of your fingers. You eat beans and rice and beans for a couple of years, and then you're out of debt.
You work your way out of it.
Absolutely.
We'll come back and continue with Dr. Cassidy, and we will open the phone lines. Mark, I see you there. Join Mark at 499-9526, 499-WJBO. U.S. Congressman Dr. Bill Cassidy is here with us live in studio at 21 minutes after the hour here on WJBO. Got to go to the phones in just a second here. Standard & Poor's downgraded our credit rating, and they are now under investigation by the Department of Justice. You know, I could be cynical and say that the two things are tied together. I want to be cynical and say that, but I won't necessarily. I'll just ask you if you think that these things are connected in any way.
It's easy to. You're right. It's absolutely easy to be cynical, but the first you have to do is find out the facts of it.
That's right.
On the other hand, the downgrades seem kind of silly. No one doubts that the American government is able to pay its bills. And we just demonstrated that we're committed to doing so. And so if the whole point is to speak about our ability to pay the bills, it was a stupid downgrade. On the other hand, if you're saying our economy is weak, which was part of their critique, and that our banks are tied in with the European debt crisis, which is part of their critique, well, that's a reasonable thing.
You got more hands in a game of Texas Hold'em there. But their reasoning is, and I agree with it to a degree, that we didn't do enough. And the process was so anchored, weighted down with politics. What about that? I mean,
imagine that. A political process is weighed down by politics. Imagine that. You're cutting money and people are fighting. I've never heard of such a thing, except maybe in my household.
All right. Let's go to the phones here. Let's get Mark at 499-9526. Hey, Mark, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Hey, on the budget for 2010, I'm looking at a chart that shows that the federal income withholdings brought in $1.1 trillion, and we spent $895 billion on the Defense Department. I have no problem with our defense. I'm glad we spend that much. I'm glad we're the best military in the world. But the problem I see here is that, for the most part, the defense budget is being covered by the people who who earn wages in this country, who have deductions, and that's not really a good representative share for the people of this country. I think the best way to handle the defense budget, and thus fix the rest of the budget, would be to come up with something like a federal property tax, so that people who have these large ranches like Harry Reid and these large properties like Donald Trump or even Mr. Benson would pay a greater share for the greater amount that they have being defended and the greater amount they have being protected by the military budget.
I've not thought about your last point. I will say that I think you, I, Clay, even Kevin deserve to be defended as much as Warren Buffett.
Oh, yeah. But we don't have as much to defend as far as land and property as say Donald Trump or these Hollywood stars with their ranches out in Montana. And I'm not being jealous. I'm just saying.
I don't know that there's any provision in the law for a federal property tax.
And why target those guys specifically?
Well, it's not targeting them. Let's say we exempt 1 acre for every citizen, and then everything after that, you pay a little bit extra for it. Now, you look at all the acres you would spread it out among, it would almost be, it would be so small and minuscule. Plus, you could give that money back to the people as far as so that people working at ExxonMobil aren't paying for Mr. Benson's greater share of defense. So that these people can have their money back and we can spread it out.
I have never heard this argument before.
That's a brand new one there, Mark. You broke new ground. Thank you. All right, I'll give you a chance to respond to that.
You broke new ground, but you're going to have to pay taxes on that ground.
Mark, one point...
By the way, disagree with the argument, let me, for the record.
One point I want to bring up is that, and what, again, is not paid attention to by the media, is that there is actually going to be about a $1.2 trillion savings in the military budget over the next 10 years, and that's predicted because we're getting out of Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right.
Now, if you look at Harry Reid's way to save money, he was basing it entirely almost on the $1 trillion we're saving from getting out of Afghanistan and Iraq and the interest savings from not paying that deficit. The Republicans said, wait a second, we know what's going to happen, but we want other cuts. But that, in both the Ryan Republican budget and the president's budget, there's about $1 trillion in savings predicted on getting out of those two wars. It's just Republicans are adding that onto the top of the deal that was just struck, and others were making it the entire deal. So there will be savings in defense, and if you add that to the deal that was struck, you're getting up close to $4 trillion in savings over 10 years.
What you just heard from the caller a moment ago is a big chunk of what we heard during the debt ceiling debate and what we hear right now, which I think is a form of classism where we are pitting wealthy against poor, and I think it's dangerous.
Now, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Clay, let me just point out something. Again, if you look at, I'm so struck, the president's health care bill, some people call it Obamacare, but the president's health care bill, the Affordable Care Act, levied taxes of about $500 billion. Now, as it turns out, we were coming out of the recession, and we dropped $500 billion in new taxes on the economy. And then we're going into a double-dip recession.
Yeah.
So now folks want to raise another $400 billion in taxes. Well, are we going to have a triple-dip recession? If you talk to, in fact, last time I was on this program, a small business owner called in and said that he was not replacing an employee he had left off because of fear of taxes. Now, at some point, I remember that old expression, the beatings will continue until morale improves. It's like we're going to keep raising your taxes till you give us more money. The fact is, when you tax folks, the small business owners decide to spend less, hire fewer people, our recession continues. I don't see raising taxes as the answer because Obamacare raised taxes, and frankly, that's hurting the economy.
But why is that such a difficult concept to grasp? I mean, that's pure economics, that the more money the people have, the more money they can spend, which is a good thing for America. Why is that so hard to grasp, and why does that have to become partisan? I mean, isn't that just common sense?
Because the president thinks you have to eat your peas alone. On the other hand, Republicans think that you can grow the economy. They think it's not Republicans, we don't think it's a zero-sum game. That if the small business owner is hiring more people, then those other people are paying taxes, not because they're taxed more, but because they have a better paying job.
Right.
And so one solution, just like Dave Ramsey says, you take a second job and you get more income, you grow your income. Well, our point is we can grow our economy to the degree that we are actually going to partly grow out of this debt crisis.
All right. Do we have time here, Neil? All right, we're going to come back and get Gene, Brian, and Mark. Phone lines are open at 499-9526, 499-WJBO. The next segment will just be the congressman answering your calls, so we'll get through them. 29 after 8.
And time for Ray Romero in the traffic center.